Okay.
And I kind of make things up as I go along.
That's even better. And good afternoon, everyone. This is Kathleen Taylor. I'm with the Nevada Women's Business Center. I am so pleased to again have a really great resource partner with us today, Mr. Cornelius Eason.
Good afternoon.
And Cornelius, he's here to once again provide your expertise about HR. And for those of you that are business owners or you're in the business of HR, then this is a fantastic subject piece in regarding giving you some tips on how to enhance workplace or individual performance. So with Cornelius, I'd like to share a couple things with you about him. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate that.
Yep.
Yes. So Cornelius, he's currently the owner and principal advisor at HR Business Partner, which he launched in January of 2015. The firm provides human resource services to small, mid-sized, and large organizations with a particular focus on integrating HR into the strategic operations of enterprises. Also, his team of experienced HR practitioners also work with organizational leadership to plan for manpower needs, development, and sourcing. Cornelius has also been the director of regional strategies for Workforce Connections, a workforce development agency where he worked to develop a network of skills training and job placement organizations. And you've been on a plethora and currently, past and present, a plethora of different boards and serving in a service capacity based upon your expertise in certain areas of interest within the community. So thank you so much for being here.
Yep, absolutely.
You know, what I really find intriguing about your background is that you understand both ends of the spectrum in reference to your prior work in workforce development. So you're in the core of developing the curriculum and making sure that your clients were job ready, so to speak.
Mhm.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, here you were from an HR perspective to make sure that, okay, we need to hire on the right people for these positions in order to meet the company's bottom line, to ensure the mission of the organization is fulfilled. And all of that comes down to people. So you're basically in the people business
I'm absolutely in the
with
people
HR,
business.
yes. So with that, taking it from enhancing performance or on the workplace, how important is hiring the right person for the right position? Let's start there.
You know, it's critical. That's 90% of the game is hiring the right person. So taking the time to hire the right person with the right skill set and the right temperament.
Right.
Okay, so a lot of times we overlook personality and temperament and fit for the culture, the work environment, the pace of the work, and that kind of thing. We overlook that and we replace that with skills, and it's not always equivalent. So hiring the right person and getting them in the right position is critical. And that eliminates a lot of the problems that are going to happen down the stream by trying to fit if you will, a square peg into a round hole.
Right.
So it's really, really important. The second part of it is to, when you're a business owner or the general manager, is to establish and then reinforce a culture. Okay, whatever your culture is, your core values. Okay, so what are the values of our company? Okay, what's important to us? And values lead to mission. So what are we ultimately trying to accomplish? And by and large, it's sell a product or a service. And so how do we get there? And then what are the rules that we will follow that goes along with your values there? And along with the mission, and what are our strategies? How are we going to get to market, right? So what are these broad things that we're going to do to get to market? and then you go from there. And so as you define those things and as you keep those in place, that will tell you who you need to hire for each individual position, because as you get to strategies and tactics in the day-to-day operations of a business, they'll tell you, I need this person to perform this function, I need this function and that function. And so those things just kind of flow into themselves. But it starts with number one, like I said, creating an environment in which you know what your values are, you know what you're trying to accomplish, and then hire the right people to do that.
So, how important is encouraging or cultivating really good open communication system within the company to enhance employee performance? How key is that?
You know, once again, I talked about what's critical in terms of hiring the right people. Well, communications is just as important, and it starts with leadership. It starts with either the owner or the most senior person in terms of day-to-day operation of the business. You know, what are they trying to accomplish? What's the vision? Let's go back to what's the mission, and then how are we going to get that there? And so to be able to communicate, and it's not a one-way communication. It is, I expect feedback, whether you agree with me or not. And there's a professional way to disagree. So, you know, we don't yell and scream, and we don't want you to, throw spitballs at me, but we want you to communicate and give me your feedback, and I'll either accept it or I'll tell you why it doesn't fit in with what my expectations are. But at the very least, we had an exchange of ideas there, and you know what's going on. At the same time, and I think I mentioned this to you offline, is that it's a 360 communication, so it's all the way around. So it's upwards and it's downwards, right? So it's a superior to a subordinate, but it's also peer-to-peer. So peers should be able to communicate, and sometimes that can be tricky. So if you have something of a critical nature to communicate to a peer, you've got to figure out how to do that in a professional way without offending them, but in a constructive way. But it could be praise as well. You could be complimenting someone. Boy, I just saw Fred, you did a really good job. Margie, that was fantastic you did last week. And that doesn't happen a lot of times. A lot of times in environments or in businesses, people wait for their supervisor to praise them or give them compliments. And so you kind of expect that. And so it does have meaning when that happens. But boy, if the person that's sitting next to you every single day goes, you know what, I was kind of watching and I like the way you do that. That was really, really special. You know, most people will value that as much as they value the praise from their superior. You have an expectation your superior is going to do that, and then you have an expectation for a reward from that, right? And it's probably a raise or a positive a performance evaluation or that kind of thing. But when a peer compliments you, it is simply a matter of pride and professional pride.
I agree. And looking at it from the other side of the table, so to speak, what happens when you have the underperforming employee, or worse yet, the underperforming leader in the organization? How do you handle that to enhance performance?
Well, let's start with the individual, because the leader, that's kind of a tricky one. Well, once again, I go back to, early upstream is hiring the right person, right? And so you set the expectation, and then along with expectations, you have outcomes. So you have very specific goals, and you have very specific outcomes that you expect for that person. Things that can be quantified and measured, and that are time-based. So if
those are SMART goals.
Those are SMART goals. Exactly.
Yes,
exactly. So they're defined and they're time-based. They're not nebulous. They're not open to subjective evaluation. These are things I expect you to produce this, I expect you to lose that, and then I'm going to give you feedback one way or the other. So if we get to a situation where you are underperforming, there are indicators to both me and to you along the way that there was a trend happening there. And so for an astute manager and a conscientious individual performer, they should be sensitive to those trends along the way and correct them if they care. right? So we'll
Right.
get to caring and passion and that kind of thing down the road. But there should be indicators. If you have set your goals and objectives and you're measuring them and you're continuously giving feedback, then you should be able to correct trends along the way. If for some reason those get out of hand, then you have to sit down and you have to have a firm professional conversation with an individual and say, these are the results we expected. We clearly communicated with them and this is not happening. So we're going to develop a plan together so
Right.
that we correct that, your outcomes. And so if that's additional training that you need, it will look at your workload and your work schedule and environmental conditions and see if do we need to change anything there. And if we need to adjust any of those things, the training, the environment, and those kinds of things, we will do those. But we expect at this time, once again, it's time based,
Right.
for this, your outcomes to change and improve to our expectations. And beyond that, if it doesn't, you have to evaluate what your internal processes are, what your internal expectations are. How many times do you have that conversation? And then, as a business owner, there is a point where you have to make a hard decision, and you have to make that quickly. Will this change? Will you be able to improve the performance of an
Right.
individual? And if not, then you have to have that person removed. And it's not personal, it's professional, it's based on
Right.
business outcomes, and they move on to another opportunity and you replace them with a person that you think is going to perform up to standard.
Absolutely. And now, what are your thoughts about from an underperforming leader position?
Boy, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's a
because,
tough one.
I mean, I just find it interesting how commonly, so to speak, whenever we're talking about enhancing performance in the workplace or engagement in the workplace or when there's issues in the workplace, people automatically default to the staff, the employees. They don't necessarily, think, well, wait a minute, maybe there's a problem with leadership, maybe there's an issue with an underperforming business owner, an underperforming president of the organization, and it's affecting the whole culture and the whole dynamic where it's impacting staff performance, it's impacting staff productivity. So how do you deal with that issue?
Well, so I'm going to first of all take the perspective that there is a chain of command, and we didn't go to the top right away. We're
Okay.
not talking about the owner because that's a whole different ball of wax. But
Okay.
if there are supervisors that have supervisors, and so there is a chain of command, and somewhere along that chain of command, somebody is underperforming. So, first of all, you have to have their superior that is paying attention, have done those things that we talked about earlier, set the expectations, set the goals, and that on a regular basis evaluates them and gives them feedback. So that's one. The other thing is you really have to look at the attitude and turnover, things like that, of their direct reports.
Okay.
So you will hear many times that employees don't quit companies, they quit bosses.
Right.
And so if you see that there is constant turnover, and if you happen to have an exit interview and that employee gives you either directly or indirectly feedback about that supervisor, and it's consistent with other employees that have given you some feedback about that supervisor, you have to take that seriously. And so then you combine that with their performance, because they may be performing. So the outcomes, they may be
Right.
producing 25 of these things that you want per week, and their goal is 20, so they're exceeding that. But the attitude and the morale of the
Yes.
workforce
Yes.
is not conducive to the environment, and that's because of the supervisor. And so when you get those things, then you have to have a different conversation. You have to evaluate whether or not they have the right temperament. Then you go back to your toolbox and you say, is it training? Is it environment? Are there some personal stresses that are going on? So does that supervisor have some things going on in their personal life that's causing them to be in a bad mood or stressful? Are they taking it out? Are they the right person? You know, a lot of times people are promoted because they're really good producers as an individual, but they don't have the temperament to be a supervisor and
Exactly.
have those interpersonal skills that you need as a supervisor. So you have to
Exactly.
take those all into consideration. And as the responsibility increases, as the span of control increases, it becomes even more complex, and it becomes even more sensitive, because removing a person as they get more responsibility in your company and replacing them is not as easy as simply,
Right.
terminating a person and hiring a
Yes.
new person, because you've invested in that person.
Yes, you
And so,
have.
can you adjust it? Can you do it through training, through counseling, and that kind of thing? So that's a tricky one. So the owner, let's address being an owner, and the owner, that's a really hard one. I mean, you would hope that, because who's the owner's boss, right? Maybe they have an advisory board. By and large, they don't.
Yeah.
Maybe they have a husband that teaches them, takes them at home and says, "Hey, listen, wife, it doesn't look like your company's doing so well. What are you doing?" Or husband, your company's not doing so well. Or maybe somebody encourages them, because many time owners have peers, other owners, and
Yes.
that's really their feedback loop, is to talk to somebody else, because they don't have a boss, and that, so they talk to peers. I got this going on in my company, and hopefully you have friends and business associates that'll give you some honest feedback. Have you
Right.
thought about this? Are you around enough? Do the employees understand your expectations?
Right.
Have you communicated these things? Because if you've had to terminate, 20% of your workforce in the last year,
That's
well,
huge.
why did that happen?
Right.
Have you set the right expectations? I go back to that. Did you hire the right people and that kind of thing? So hopefully there's some kind of feedback mechanism, and a lot of owners do belong to other groups, a CEO group,
Yeah.
or that kind of thing, where either they get direct feedback or they hear a discussion, kind of a group therapy kind of
Yes.
thing,
Yes.
and they learn from that, and they're open enough to learn from it. If you've got a person that's not involved in any of those things, they don't really have a feedback loop or support group, or they're not open to it, it's my way or the highway,
Right.
then you as an individual have to make a decision whether or not you want to work in that environment. And
Yes.
I think we've all been there once or twice, and so. But that's not an easy one. That's not as clear cut as it is correcting the performance or setting the stage for good performance from an individual contributor.
Well, I really like the way you answered that question, quite frankly. I know it was kind of like, thrown out there, but given your experience in the HR sector and also in the work development sector, it really does give you a well-rounded perspective as to this is how I would see it in a qualified employee, because you've been there to develop that person to be job ready, so to speak.
Well, but I would add, frankly, it's not only from the HR or the employment workforce development. It's having been that owner, having been a small
Yes.
business owner,
Yes.
and early on, I was pretty hard nosed about things, and I literally experienced people leaving in that, and I would have conversations with the staff that were around. I go, well, they didn't do this, they didn't do that, and I wonder why they would want to quit this job. And one person just closed the door with me one day and said, "Hey, you ever look in the mirror? You ever think
Wow.
about how you were managing people? And then
Wow.
when you're in a bad mood, you expect people to understand that you're in a bad mood, and you sometimes had the attitude, because you signed the front of their paycheck, that they're supposed to tolerate
Yeah.
the way you do things, and there was no open communications where people give you feedback and say, "Hey, listen, it's Friday at 6 o'clock. I got a family that I go to. I'm supposed to get off at 5." Those kinds of things, and I had to take a good hard look. And then I started, like I said, I mean, all these things that I'm saying come from experience. Then I just
Excellent.
started talking to some peers and saying, "Hey, you run into this?" And they go, "Yeah," and they say, "Yeah, and I've watched you a little bit. You can be pretty hard nosed, and no matter what you pay, it's not the compensation foundation that keeps people in the jobs all the time. It's the work environment, it's interaction. So I had to do some soul searching, and so this is an evolution. It's
Wow.
not simply an HR. It's not simply an HR person here sitting. This is a business owner that has
Excellent.
been those that did not have a boss that could call them and say you're not doing these things right. It took a person with some courage to say, hey, you're kind of a jerk sometimes.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that perspective as a former and successful entrepreneur, actually. So you've kind of like been through the whole gamut, so to speak, from A to Z. So what how do you how do you how do you reward um, a really good work ethic? How do you reward or acknowledge a person for being that peak performer or on the road of peak performance in the job place? And also, how do you discipline some people for underperforming? Or is that too black and white these days? Is it better to kind of like work in the gray area instead of an either or? Let's just try to figure out what is the middle ground here.
I think it's always a gray area, and once again, I go back to setting the right expectations, and then it goes back to your value system. What I believe that every manager, owner, uh, should believe is that every person in their organization is going to be successful.
I agree.
So we set the stage that you are going to succeed. So what are the things that I need to do to have you be successful? First of all, I need to make sure that you're the right person in the right position.
Right.
Right? So I don't want to set you up for failure. I want to make sure that the environment's right. So you have all the tools that you need to perform your job to the extent that we have the resources to provide those tools. I want to make sure you're trained, and you're trained properly. So a lot of times people will hire people and they'll go sit with John or go sit with Anita for a couple of days, and then you'll get the job. Well, that may or may not be sufficient, and so you're not setting them up for success necessarily. You're setting them up to be challenged. Right. And so a lot of times you have smart people and they'll get it, but sometimes you don't. And it's not because they weren't bright enough or motivated enough. It's
Right.
because they just didn't have enough training. So you've got to create that environment with the expectation that everybody's going to be successful. And then, like I said, along the way, you're constantly evaluating. You're saying, is this person performing, up to expectations, or are they performing beyond expectation? Because if they are, then you say maybe I can give them new challenges. If they're not, we got to make some adjustments that we talked about earlier. So the rewards, though, come along the way as you see those things. One way or the other is you acknowledge it, right? And so for a lot of people, that pat in the back near the coffee pot was enough to make their day,
Right.
and so they go
Right.
back to their workspace and they're motivated and they're ready to go. Sometimes it's a bonus here and there. Sometimes it's a gift, or sometimes it's being flexible, right? Okay, so there are a lot of parents in the workforce these days,
Yes.
male and female, that need flexible schedules. So I know that you've got a third grader and they got out of school at 3:15. So on some days you're going to need to be flexible and get off. And so that's a reward. You're producing, you're
Right.
doing your job, you're
Right.
going the extra mile. Maybe even without me asking you, you come in at 7 o'clock. Your normal time is 8 o'clock because you've got to get that work done. And so I'm going to say you take off at 3 o'clock. I'll let you manage your time. So that's a reward there.
I
And you
agree.
tell them that you're acknowledging performance. Don't just assume that they know that's why
Yes,
you're doing
you have
it.
to tell
You
them.
make sure that you're telling them. And of course, when there is an evaluation, whether it's monthly, yearly, and whatever your incentive program is, you make sure they're compensated for their work. So there's lots of ways to reward people, and it's a continuous thing. It's not a black and white thing. Now, discipline on another thing has to be, number one, it has to be based on objectives and performance, and once again, that time based, and it has to be very clear what the discipline is. It's just like a child.
Right.
You have to make sure they understand why they're being disciplined, exactly what the discipline is, and what the expectation is after the discipline has been applied.
Right.
Right? And then what happens next? Do you get two chances, or is this it? or will we go back to normal? So, once we've corrected this behavior or we've corrected this performance, then you're just like everybody else. I'm not
Right.
going to hold this against you.
Right.
It's not like you've got a black mark against your name. We worked through this situation. We corrected it. I could see that you were motivated to correct it. And so we go on in our normal work environment. And so it's nowhere near, in my opinion, a black or white
Not at
area. It's
all.
all gray, and it should
I
be
agree.
continuous, And
Yes.
then sometimes discipline isn't as formal as it is. It may be just like you give a person a pat on the back at the coffee pot. Maybe sometimes you have to say, "Hey, listen, I notice what's going on. You leave it a little earlier, so you have to get out of here at 3:50, and we're leaving at 4. What, you got something going on? Do we need to adjust your schedule?" That kind of thing. So that's a way of acknowledging that something is going on there. Or, I noticed the quality of your work slipped a little bit. Got a little bit going. Do you have something going on there, or do you have too much work, or
Right.
something going on in your personal life, and that kind of thing? So that's a way of giving feedback. It's not quite
I
a
agree.
formal disciplinary process,
agree.
but it's feedback to say that, I know there's, you're not performing as well as you should be, but it's leading up to a more formal process.
Right. Now, speaking of evaluation excuse me, speaking of like managing the people within the workplace, what do you think about from a generational perspective? I'm 47. I'm a boomer, maybe on the younger spectrum of boomers, so to speak. And the way that I was brought up in professionally in the workforce is very different now when you compare how people manage millennials in the workplace. So, do you have like any tips? I know that what you have shared thus far is universal, basically, in application, but specifically, is there like a certain type of like magic, so to speak, in managing the performance of a millennial in the workplace?
Well, that's a tough one. That's not easy. And I'm a boomer too. So that's what we struggle with all the time. Because a part of me goes, "Hey, get over it. This is a fad. Just get in the real world, get a job. It's
my
9 to
gosh.
5, Monday through Friday." And, but that's not realistic these days. I think once again, it goes back to the environment. Right.
Okay.
It's you as the owner, the operator, the manager, general manager. It's what environment do you want, right? Does your environment accommodate a flexible work schedule? Does your environment or your business accommodate a remote working situation,
Yes.
that kind of thing?
Uh-huh.
Does it accommodate a loose atmosphere where there are no walls, right? And so there's an open area where there is collaboration. Does your environment require, because of your customer set or just your own values, does it a formal work attire, or is it more casual? Is it really, really extreme casual? That kind of thing. You have I won't say extremes, but you have very avant-garde models like Zappos. If you
Yes.
ever go to their environment, the workspaces are decorated in all kinds of ways that express their personality, and they have all kind of recreational kinds of options and those kinds of things, and that works fine for the culture they established from the beginning and have just grown it. And they hire people that fit into that
Right.
culture.
Right.
And it goes back to hiring the right people. In fact, if I use Zappos as an example, Zappos, after a period of time of evaluating you and your temperament and your fit into the culture, that if it's determined that you're not a fit, they will pay you to leave the company.
Wow.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I think it's they'll give you $5,000 or some amount of money like that to leave the company because it was not a fit.
Wow.
So everybody doesn't fit into that culture. So it goes back to the owner. The most senior leadership has to determine what kind of environment, and then you hire people to fit in that. Millennials, they say, I don't believe this is all for all of them, but there are some that want flexible work schedules for whatever reason. They have other interests. They don't live to work; they work to live.
Right.
Right. So if you've set the right expectations, you can get the productivity from them. that's fine. If it doesn't impact your business or your customers or service and that kind of thing, and you can live with it, I have a hard time living with it. You know, even though I've been a remote employee on several occasions, I still have a hard time believing that Tom is out there working as hard as he can if he's working from home. You know, but I have to deal with it. And in my business right now, you know, my workers, I don't have a centralized office. But I trust them. If as long as I get my projects on time and the quality I want and that, I just have to get over it, you know. So if I call them and I get voicemail at 9:30 in the morning and I suspect they're still asleep, I just have to get over that. So I think you have to, you know, you have to look at your tolerance, you have to look at your business model, you have to look at your customer set, and you have to adjust to it. And I think there are some very smart millennials and Gen Y, Gen X out there. I think there are a lot of those people that were raised in environments that are closer to what you might consider a boomer's structure, where there is stability in terms of longevity of employment, where there's a structured environment. So there's a lot of people that fit there. Once again, it's finding the right people and fitting them into your environment. But you hear so many stories about millennials, and I think that the ones that aren't successful, it goes back to hiring the wrong person and putting them in the wrong situation.
Sure, I agree. And with that, how important is it to have this type of like training and because some people do training, but then they kind of like max out, so to speak. So how important it is to keep training material fresh with trends, with things that are trending, so to speak. Because after a while, once you hear one training about emotional intelligence in the workplace, for example, after a while it becomes old hat. So how important it is to keep training available to enhance staff professional development, but also to keep the subject fresh, up to date, so to make it engaging, and that also can lead to enhanced performance in the workplace.
I think if you have the luxury as a business owner, operator, and the resources of facilitating lifelong learning. And lifelong learning is not necessarily out of a textbook or in a classroom or in a course, but it is maintaining knowledge of what's going on in your industry. It's belonging to professional organizations. It's reading trade journals. It's attending conferences. It's those kinds of things. It's having a general knowledge of what's going on in the business community. If you're in the financial institution, you want to know what's going on in all business. If you're in technology, you want to learn what's going on in the industry that your technology is applied to. You know, if you don't have the luxury of allowing people to go to conferences or take courses or belong to trade groups and that kind of thing, you could simply hold brown bag lunches where you have a lunch and a discussion group. So if there is one or two persons, or even if it's only you that attend that conference, we have a conversation about it. You know, if you're the person that is the knowledge bank, then you share that in an informal environment so that you know this is what's going on. You know, Kathleen, I know that you have one of your clients is XYZ company. I just read an article about them in the Wall Street Journal. They're doing this and this, and it's dependent upon their suppliers. And, you know, this trucking company went Chapter 11, so it affects their ability to get these supplies. Did you think about that at all? I hadn't thought about that, but let me go to some homework on that, because that person doesn't have the time or maybe the motivation to read the Wall Street Journal, but now they know, and so they can Google it and say. And so you can drive that if it's important to you as an owner to have learners, people that are interested in what's going on in their industry, in your business, and that kind of thing. So it doesn't have to be a formalized training. You're right, because people max out, and you can only, you know, reiterate the same subject, emotional intelligence or those kinds of things, you know, so many times. So you come at it from a different perspective.
Very good. So how do you manage the performance of someone that just basically flat out tells you, um, I'm just here to collect a check and I have bills to pay. That's it. And they really don't have a buy-in into the company's mission, so to speak. Now, granted, they've already been through the whole process of they passed the test of hiring the right person for that position. But then for some reason along the way, that has shifted or changed into I'm just here to clock in, collect my check, and clock out. I'm done. So how do you how what type of methods or what type of advice would you give a business owner or someone in HR, um, some strategies to help that person turn the corner, so to speak, that you're waking up to the mission versus the paycheck?
They didn't tell me you were going to have really hard questions.
That's because I know you can handle them. I know you've been doing great.
Well, that's not an easy one. You're right, and there are lots of people like that, and they won't tell you as directly as you just communicated that they're just here.
Right.
But you know it in their attitude. They're not motivated, and they're performing. You set out their goals and their objectives, and they're performing, and so they're doing that. But they are a cancer in your organization because of their attitude, and whether it's just their personality or things going on in their personal life, or they're simply that kind of person that wants to gossip, or they're anti-everything. That's a tough one. I think what you have to try to do is establish some kind of relationship with that person and try to get inside of their attitude and say, hey, listen, did you think about you? So you can't come at it necessarily directly. You got to evaluate. Everybody's different. So you got to evaluate who they are, and maybe you can find some interests. So maybe you strike up a conversation about baseball or about football or about skateboarding or whatever it happens to be. Maybe they're a video game enthusiast. You say, let's talk about video games. You ever think about, these platforms here? Why don't you come in and at lunchtime, why don't you tell the rest of the group about, your world of video games and that? And they go, really? Yeah, why not? They might be interested in what you're doing. And so you tap into something that's of interest to them to get them motivated. Now, that takes patience.
Yes, it does.
It takes effort because once again, I go back to my boomer days. I want to just grab you or I just want you to just get out of here. But, I have to, I'm using my my huggy, feely.
Emotional intelligence
training. I'm using all that. But you try to find a way to motivate. Everybody's motivated by something, or everybody is demotivated by something. If there's something going on in their personal lives, then there's a fine line there, which you can't get in their personal life. Which you can say, you know what, this might be some emotional relief when you come here for these 8 hours. So what are the things that interest you? Can you incorporate them into this work environment where it makes sense, right? We're still a business. There's work to be done, but we have breaks, we have lunch, we have special projects, right? So we're going to do this community vendor fair here in 2 weeks. How'd you like to organize the employees and get the decorations going, or arrange for the lunch or that kind of thing? And you might perk their interest because they're doing something that's not necessarily job related. So you, as the owner, the person that has most at stake, you should probe and find those things. And maybe you learn their background. They're a distance runner, or they're a race car fan, or whatever it is. Or maybe they have no interest at all. You say, hey, you ever think about this? I remember you told me when you were in high school you liked track and field. Do you ever look at the meets online? No, I didn't. So you try to have them, most people want to be acknowledged and know that you care, and you've got some empathy for them. You've given them some time. So you make every effort you can, and then, there may be a point where you strictly have to, they're performing, you don't want to, or you can't legally terminate them, so you try to isolate them as much as possible. That which should be, once again, a last resort, isolating them from the rest if they are that negative influence on the rest of your workforce.
I understand. Well, I
Boy,
tell you,
I
I've been
answered that one right. I was doing some dancing.
I tell you, your dance card is full because I am a happy camper. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I know that I threw some things at you, And I learned a lot. I'm pretty sure our audience has learned a lot too in reference to enhancing individual performance in the workplace. So to kind of like wrap things up, or are there any like one or two key points that you'd like to share with the audience in closing? And
Well,
also, could you please provide the audience with your contact information in case someone would like to connect with you?
no, absolutely. Once again, I go back. It's really, really important to establish the work environment. So you're setting up your work environment so that everyone can be successful. So within the resources that you have available to you, do you have the tools? Are people going to be trained correctly? Is it a positive environment? You want to eliminate any negativity. So you're setting up an environment where people can be successful, and then you hire the right people, and then you continually observe them and make sure that they're on a path for success. And I think that lays the foundation for 90% of what you'll encounter. And then the rest of it they can call you, and I'm sure you'll get some answers. But if you'd like to reach out to me, my website is www, of course, hr-biz-partner.com, hr-biz-partner.com. You can call me if you'd like. My phone number is 702-427-8455. My email is ceason at hr-biz-partner.com. Thanks, this was fun. I was a little nervous about it. I wasn't sure what you were going to ask me.
I couldn't tell.
You did give me a couple of tricky ones there, and I hope there's nobody out. Attorneys just love to hear HR people talk about these kind of things. So I hope there are no attorneys out there just going, boy, I'm going to get him. So, but thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you once again for tuning in to this live stream webinar. I'm Kathleen Taylor with the Nevada Women's Business Center. And once again, thank you so much, Cornelius, for being our expert featured speaker here today to talk about enhancing performance in the workplace, or individual performance in the workplace. So if you have any questions, please call us at area code 702. I'm about to give you my cell phone number. Hold on, let me kind of like backtrack here. 702-734-3555, or check us out online at www.nevadawbc.com. Thank you. Take care. Bye. Excellent. This is great.
I hope so.
Absolutely.
So.